Okay, welcome all. I'm really happy to see that most of you have stayed for the entire day. So that means that you have attended probably very interesting sessions and that you still have a lot of energy left. So we come to the last part of today's symposium. And we have this morning, we had a great plenary speech by Trish Greenhalgh, who's a professor of Oxford. Now we have another great professor from the other side of the North Sea, and that's Professor Mike Drummond from the University of York. I think many of you already know Mike, and if you haven't seen him yet in person, you probably have read one of his books. I think he's the author of the most successful book in health economics, and it's about economic evaluation. And you have been working in the field for 40 years probably, so you're suitable, the right candidate to have a talk. Well, Mike, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, hello everyone, and thanks for that introduction. Thanks for inviting me. So I'm going to talk about economic evaluation in healthcare, which probably won't come as a surprise because that's my main field of interest. But it's also been a strong theme of research within this department over the years. And also it's part of the maintenance of financial stability in healthcare, although having just attended the value-based healthcare session, I realise it's not as simple as I thought it was. But the idea that you could examine treatments and programmes from the point of view of what benefits do they give in relation to their costs, that in theory that should help you make a better allocation of healthcare resources and spend your budget more wisely. But we'll see. So I'm going to talk about what next, but to get to the what next, I have to go through a bit of history. So I'm going to address these three questions. First of all, has economic evaluation in healthcare been successful? And I'll define how I mean success a bit later on. And then if it has been successful, why has it been successful? And by analysing why has it been successful, I think that tells us what we need to do next, because I think we've been successful by ignoring some of the difficulties in life, and maybe we need to get to that. And so in this way, my talk is somewhat parallel to Trish's talk, although we hadn't colluded at all, but I'll be coming at these points of complexity from a slightly different angle. Okay, so since this is the anniversary, I thought we'd do a bit of history. So the first recognisable economic evaluations were studies towards the end of the 1960s. There was a study in the States by Herbert Klarman on renal dialysis, looking at different dialysis modalities and their cost effectiveness. In the UK, we had a guy called David Powell who looked at screening with radiography for tuberculosis at the time. And he actually went on to be the chief economic advisor in our Department of Health, which I think is one of the reasons why health economics in the UK has had the sort of policy influence that it has had, because we've always had our set of economists in the ministry, our fifth column actually in the ministry, subverting matters and trying to get the ministry to think straight about a few things. One thing that's maybe surprising is that we talk about QALYs and health status indices. The first conference on that was in 1972, which is quite a long time ago. But the term quality adjusted life years didn't actually appear until around 1976. It started appearing in some papers published by researchers at Harvard University. And then I've put Erasmus, it's 1982. I got to 1982 by deducting 40 from 2022. But I don't know whether you're actually having your anniversary at the real time. That with COVID and everything, everybody's having their anniversaries after the event. My daughter, who works at the British Museum, was going to their Christmas party, that's Christmas last year, 2 weeks ago, and it was postponed by COVID. So she was really looking forward to it, and then she tested positive the day before. so she didn't make it. So I don't know whether the school was doing economic evaluations right at the beginning, but certainly by 1988, when IMTO was founded, clearly Erasmus in Europe was one of the major centres for doing cost-effectiveness studies and health technology assessment. Another milestone, particularly if you're from the developing world, is the development of the disability-adjusted life year estimates by the World Bank and WHO in the World Bank's report for 1990. And then in 1991, Australia became the first country actually to use cost-effectiveness analysis for listing of drugs on their national formulary. They already had a process by which drugs would be evaluated before being listed on the national formulary, but they added economics beginning in 1992. And then there's a couple of books. The journal Pharmacoeconomics came out in 1992, and you see quite a lot of things happened in the late 1990s. The Canadians published their pharmacoeconomic guidelines. There was ISPOR, was started originally, called itself APOR. Then the Journal of Value in Health was launched in 1998, and the guidelines in the Netherlands came out in 1999. And NICE in the UK was established in the same year. So there was quite a lot towards the end of the 1990s, but if you look at the school here, 1982 was pretty early to the table, wasn't it, if in the overall scheme of things. So based on all that, one element of being successful is establishing yourself. So how's economic evaluation been established? Well, it's certainly got established methods, and I think you could argue there's been continuous methodological development, probably not as much as some people would have liked. It's been established as part of the reimbursement process for health technologies, most notably pharmaceuticals, in a wide range of countries. You know, it really is part of the decision-making process. ISPOR, prior to the pandemic, had grown to more than 20,000 members worldwide, if you count all the regional and local chapters. When it started around 1995, the membership was 240 people. So you could see that was quite a big growth. Whether all those members were actually doing health economics is another thing, but at least the society was collecting membership fees from 20,000 people. And actually, unemployed health economists are fairly hard to find. It's a funny thing about that quote that when I talk on the master's course at York, I mention that because I'm trying to make these young people feel positive about their future. You know, you'll always have a job. And Professor Alistair Maguire, a friend of mine, his son actually did our course. And Alistair asked him, do you remember anything from Mike Drummond's lectures? And his son said, yes, he told me there'd be no unemployed health economists. Nothing about methods or examples. So there's a few health economists about. So the spread in terms of decision making, I've marked in red here, and I've got Belgium and Netherlands is there, and UK, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Poland, Slovakia, Croatia, and you can see there's quite a spread around the world. I think there's a few countries that I could mark in kind of light red to kind of experimenting with the use of health economics. For example, Japan, and one or two Latin American countries, and even the US, not officially, but there's an unofficial group or a non-for-profit, independent group called ISA that do economic evaluations for the private sector private healthcare sector in the States. So there's quite a lot of that, and this is a busy slide intentionally. This is all the ISPOR chapters, or as they were before the pandemic. And you can see it's all over the place here. So we're not short of health economists, which is a good thing because we have to make ourselves useful. So this says the drug has no side effect, but the number of health economists needed to prove its value may cause dizziness and nausea. Some of you may have been in the situation where I've been, where a pharmaceutical company's got a new product that doesn't really do very much. And you're trying to ask them, well, if I'm going to establish the value, can you give me a clue? You know, and they'll say, oh, it's a new mechanism of action. But yeah, well, what does that mean? Well, we're testing it and it's non-inferior to current care. But we've told the board of the company we're going to get a big price premium and we thought you could help. So, you know, I usually say in those situations, well, you don't need a health economist with this drug, you need a magician. And then somebody will say, what's the difference between a health economist and a magician? So there's a few of us about, and but of course that doesn't mean we're doing any good. There are also some exceptions. France and Germany, arguably the most powerful countries in the European Union, they prefer not to use economic evaluation as their main way of assessing the value of new drugs. They use a concept of looking at the clinical data and determining the level of added value. And it's not all that transparent, but you can kind of get a high ranking of added value or a low one. And but they don't actually go to discuss cost effectiveness. Although, as I say on the slide here, in France, what's happened was that there were complaints about their process not being very transparent. You know, why did some drugs get a good assessment of value and other ones a poor assessment of value, for example? Which is a bit ironic because the committee is called the Transparency Commission. And so not very transparent. So what they did was they brought in a process as a supplementary backup process to do economic evaluations in situations where the drug was claimed to have a high added value, so that people could understand why the committee had said that it was high value. And it can be quite difficult. I had a friend who worked in a pharmaceutical company. He rang me up one day and he said, something terrible's happened. I said, what? You know, has your mother died or something? He said, no, IQWiG in Germany, that's the kind of the German NICE. IQWiG have said that our drug doesn't add any clinical value. And I said, well, what did they base that on? And he said, well, it's a new drug for multiple sclerosis, and one of the tests we do, kind of one of the effectiveness measures, is a 50-meter walk test. Like, how long does it take you to walk 50 meters? And he said, compared to current standard of care, which is going generic, it's quite cheap, our new drug, people can walk the 50 minutes 2 seconds quicker. And I thought, well, IQWiG maybe has a point here. But I'm a consultant, so I've got to give him an answer, haven't I? So I said, well, you go and tell IQWiG that if you're in a pub in the centre of London heading for the bar, 2 seconds could be critical. You know, it's a clinically important difference to get there 2 seconds quicker, because otherwise there'll be a football team arrives and the bar's full or something. So there are different ways of doing this, and in America they've even got a law that says you can't use QALYs. This is an exact quote from the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, Healthcare Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. And it actually says that the institute that was established as part of Obamacare is called PCORI, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. And it's written into the law that they shall not develop or employ a dollars per quality adjusted life year or similar measure as a threshold to establish what type of care is cost effective or recommended. And then in case you didn't get it the first time round, it says the Secretary shall not use such a adjusted life year or such similar measure as a threshold to determine coverage, reimbursement, or incentive programs. So they've got a law about it. You might wonder, why is there a law? Well, the pharmaceutical company spent a considerable amount of money to get that paragraph inserted. And in one way, it was a pity Trump didn't repeal Obamacare, because it would be interesting to see whether he'd have taken that paragraph out or not. But what's happened, as I hinted before, is that people have taken matters into their own hands, and the private healthcare sector in America is actually beginning to use cost-effectiveness studies to help them in their financial sustainability, even though it's banned in the US public sector. So, in judging whether we've been successful, you could say, has economic evaluation led to any improvements in the decision-making process? Has it led to any changes in decisions that might have been made? Or more fundamentally, has it actually improved health and welfare? Are there any other benefits? And obviously, the more difficult the question, the harder it is to answer. But I'll go through this. So in terms of the decision-making processes, I was trying to think about what's happened since economic evaluation came along. And these are some things that I think you could argue directly result from economic evaluation. There's been a growth in the use of these risk-sharing schemes or financial payment models to help deal with the economic uncertainty. So we heard a lot about uncertainty this morning, and basically one way of dealing with it is to say, okay, well, if there's some uncertainty, let's tailor our payment in relation to the generation of better evidence on whether something works or not. And so we've seen quite a bit of that. Some policymakers find them a lot of trouble to initiate and run these schemes, but they're certainly seeing quite a few of them now. I think there has been quite a use of economic analysis in various approaches to value-based pricing, that is trying to adopt new technologies at a price that you consider to be good value for money. I think within technology development companies, most notably pharmaceuticals, but also medical devices to some extent, there's been a refocusing of their development programs towards the delivery of added clinical values. So in the old days, a drug might be developed based on it, it's got an interesting mechanism of action. Now in the company, to get the research funds, you really have to have some kind of clinical value proposition for what you think the drug is going to do to add value. And then there's obviously been spread into other areas outside of pharmaceuticals, public health interventions and so on. So those things I think you can nail on the door of health economics. There are some things that have arisen. I think this is not just health economics, but they're partly attributable to the use of economic evaluation. For example, people are looking for much more relevant endpoints in clinical trials, things that would be recognised by patients as being beneficial, rather than just kind of a surrogate measure or whatever. I think there's been consideration of what would be the relevant alternative to compare the new therapy to, and the kind of evidence synthesis you might need to do that, going beyond head-to-head clinical trials, looking at observational data, looking at indirect treatment comparisons, and so on. Now, that may have happened anyway, but I think health economics and economic evaluations accelerated that process. I think there's more recognition that the value of a drug or technology is very sensitive to how you use it. So there's this recognition that clinical and cost effectiveness can vary by patient subgroups. Now, some countries still just approve a drug for use without really thinking about how it's going to be used. But the countries that do a lot of health technology assessment using economic evaluation actually look at precisely which patients are going to get the drug, which indications is it going to be used. I think there's also been a bit of increased transparency and accountability in the decision-making process because of the need, because of the trend to consider cost effectiveness. And I think the reason for that is that the clinical message is often quite simple, this drug will do more good than harm, or don't take it because it will do more harm than good. But the economic message is a bit more kind of nuanced, isn't it? It's sort of, well, this drug can offer benefit, but maybe it doesn't offer enough benefit to offset the costs, which could be benefits for other patients. That's a tougher thing to sell. At least I have trouble describing it over the dinner table, that dreaded moment when you get invited to dinner with some people, and the people that invited you also invite another couple of people, and the people that didn't know everybody are in the kitchen doing the meal, so you're talking to these people you've never met before. And I get that dreaded question, well, what do you do? And it's sort of, I've learned to avoid saying, oh, I do a bit of work for NICE, because there's always somebody who's had, they know somebody who's been denied treatment by some NICE guidance, and, it's particularly risky if you're having steak with sharp knives and so on. So it is a bit more difficult to explain. That's why I think there's been a lot more discussion about how the message should be put across. I think there has also been increased stakeholder involvement and a more deliberative decision-making process. Again, that may have happened without economics. And there's been this movement towards early engagement between manufacturers of technologies and payers and regulators to try and make sure that they generate the right kind of evidence package. So I think there's been quite a few changes in processes. Has it made any changes to decisions? Well, what we can see is that the use of cost effectiveness does mean that not everything just gets approved without question. So here's one study. This was done by some Canadian researchers, and they compared Canada with Australia and England. Basically the main headline there is the one in red that says, for the drugs assessed by all three agencies, the percentage listed was 84% for NICE in England, 73% for PBAC in Australia, and 52% in Canada. And then they talked about some of the reasons why those approval ratings were different. But I think the point I'm taking from it is that obviously without this assessment process, most drugs with a license from the FDA or EMA or the local regulator would get approved for use. But now, there's much more discussion about value for money. We did a study ourselves in York with some colleagues from the States, and we were just comparing the UK with the US, with the UK being a high user of economic evaluation and health technology assessment, and the US being a low user. And we looked at cancer drugs. We took all the cancer drugs that the FDA had approved from 2004, which was when a lot of the new targeted therapies were coming in, and looked at whether they were licensed in Europe, and then looked at approval in the US. We looked at CMS, which is the public sector, Medicare, Medicaid, Veterans Affairs, which is their health service for military and their dependents, and Regents, which is a private Blue Cross, Blue Shield plan. And to cut to the chase on that, if you look what happened in the US public sector, everything was approved without any restriction, which is quite common for cancer drugs. In the Veterans Affairs and Regions, everything was approved, but there were some formulary restrictions determining who you could use the drug for and so on, under what conditions. But if you look at NICE and the SMC, first thing to note was that for some of them, there wasn't a decision because, in particular, NICE was still thinking about it. And that was actually cutting use by what we call it NICE blight, which means that NICE has agreed to look at the drug. So all the payers, or our NHS, says, well, we won't pay for it until we hear what NICE has got to say. So that can cause a delay in patient access, just as it stands. But then they'd restricted some totally, didn't want them at all, and some had partial restriction. And there was they commissioned an editorial on this paper, and it was from an oncologist in University of California, Los Angeles. And I was expecting the worst, you know, these communist Brits telling us that we should restrict healthcare. But actually what she said was, you know, every country rations healthcare. The only choice you've got is how you ration. And the British are trying to ration based on some kind of scientific principles. But in America, we ration basically by your ability to pay and the insurance that you have. And bankruptcy is still, healthcare bills is still the third largest cause of bankruptcy in the US. And she's saying, well, we don't know whether the Brits are right, but you know, we really need to think about what we do in rationing care and what's the best way to ration. So, so I don't know whether we're doing the right thing either, but one of those that was approved in CMS was a cancer drug that the clinical trials showed that there was a median increase in survival of 12 days, and the drug cost $100,000, sorry. So, you know, there were some that may not be totally good value for money. So that's about changes in decisions, but what about the overall benefits of having economic evaluation in the process? Well, it gets quite difficult here, doesn't it? Because for a start, it's difficult to specify the counterfactual, you know, like what would the Netherlands be like if there wasn't ZIN? Or, you know, what would UK be like if there wasn't NICE? You can't really know what would have happened. Also, one of the arguing points is what your threshold or cutoff is, you know, how much you're willing to pay for a QALY in your country. And that's kind of unknown or uncertain for a lot of jurisdictions. One thing that came up in the value-based healthcare session is that even if you knew what's good value, you've still got to figure out mechanisms to make sure that the good value care is given and non-good value care isn't. And there are a whole series of issues about enforcing adherence to these recommendations by bodies like NICE. We have a rule that the National Health Service has to follow the guidance from NICE within 6 months. But even with that rule, there's different ways of following advice, isn't it? I mean, anybody who's got children will know that the way they adhere to your instructions can vary a lot, you know, kind of do it in principle, but not really. And so it's a bit like that in our National Health Service, that there is a rule that you've got to adopt a NICE recommendation within 6 months, but maybe there's ways of adopting it and not. And then linked to the bits about the threshold, really, you don't know what's foregone if you accept the guidance. What would you have done instead of following, say, the NICE guidance if you've got a limited budget and you're a payer? So some people have written about this. I don't know whether people know the economists Steve Birch and Amiram Gaffney. They're quite famous for being, they question a lot of things, you know, and ask the difficult questions. And they're also famous for having really good titles to their papers. They had one criticising the NICE threshold, and you know that in a notation, in a programming, you know, the Greek letter lambda is a constraint or a threshold or whatever. And they called this paper The Silence of the Lambda, which I thought was really good. You know, you sometimes read something, you think, oh, I wish I'd have thought of that. And so they wrote about NICE being the health economist's nightmare, or rather than our dream. And they're basically saying, well, actually, NICE is applying a threshold of acceptable cost effectiveness, which is actually higher than decision makers would have done in the absence of NICE. Maybe the decision makers would have been tougher on these expensive new drugs than NICE was. Also, if you tell a technology manufacturer that you're willing to pay up to $100,000 per QALY, the last decision they make is the pricing of the technology, so they can price it at $99,999 per QALY. You know, maybe it's inflationary in that sense. And also, they said, well, you know, by talking about these expensive drugs and saying that they're not cost effective, you're only drawing attention to them. You know, maybe if you ignored them, the decision makers would ignore them. Well, maybe that's right. I mean, I wrote a bit of a response to it, basically saying that, you know, in all my work with, particularly with the pharma industry, what I see is them putting the price down to make the threshold, not up to make the threshold. And, you know, there's evidence from NICE's patient access scheme. A patient access scheme is a nice British way for describing a price cut. So we call it, you know, if we go around saying we want price cuts, that sounds nasty. But we want patient access schemes. So basically it means that the manufacturer has to put their price down before the patients get access. And I think the last data I saw for new cancer drugs, I think it was around a third had a patient access scheme, maybe even higher, meaning that they weren't getting into the British NHS without some kind of price cut. But for me, if you asked me, where, you know, as a taxpayer, where's NICE bringing you value, it's from targeting therapy, I think. It very rarely says a total no. Well, it's about 15%, I think, they say no to. But often they say, well, yes, we will have this technology, but we want it delivered in certain ways to certain patients. And I think that's where they're justifying themselves, although it's worth noting that the budget of NICE in the UK, I don't know how much there's in costs, but NICE's budget is £50 million per year. So it's about, what's that, about 70,000 euros or something, 70 million euros per year. And, you know, so that's what they've got to bring in terms of value to the healthcare system to justify themselves. And that ignores, that 70 million euros ignores all the free time that people like me give them. You know, analysts and people get devoted from their other work to go and sit on NICE committees. So I don't know whether that's good value, and I don't know whether that's ridiculously expensive to what there's in costs, but that's what the budget is. And the other thing is, you know, it's all very well saying that people would ignore these expensive drugs, but surely there'd be a lot of pressure anyway to adopt these expensive new therapies from physicians and the general public, you know, whether you had a NICE or not. So I wasn't convinced of the arguments on that. So what would be my summary? I think substantial evidence that it's become an important decision-making criterion alongside other things. I think the consideration of the economic issues has highlighted the uncertainties in the clinical data. Those of you that are well versed in drug approval decisions will know that drugs now get approved at substantially less evidence than they got approved 10 years ago. That you know, they're getting approved on the basis of data that we wouldn't have accepted 10 years ago because of the pressure to get, you know, promising new drugs to patients as quickly as possible. I think although they have said no to some things, I think the main impact is on this business of targeting the therapies. And depending on how things work locally, some countries haven't gotten price reductions that they may not have got otherwise. I mean, you can always have a negotiation, can't you? You know, you go in a Moroccan market, you have a negotiation based on no information really. But at least if you've got your cost effectiveness benchmark, you get a sense of where you should be pitching your bid, so to speak, for a new drug. Okay, so that would be my sense. Well, there has been some evidence of success. But what are the reasons? Well, I think, I know Trish was giving evidence-based medicine a bit of a hard time, but I think it helped economics because it did, evidence-based medicine did sort of establish this culture that we need to look at what we're doing and whether it works. And I think it enabled health economists to be seen more as allies rather than enemies by clinicians, because clinicians are the most powerful group in the healthcare system, so you're not going to get very far if you alienate them. And so I think the evidence-based medicine movement did help a bit. I think the other main thing, though, is that we tried very hard to be policy relevant. We had these, in the UK at least, we had people within the ministry, a health economics unit within the ministry, and we did try hard to understand what decision makers cared about. And we tried to offer solutions, I think, because the tendency as an academic is to raise more questions, isn't it? I mean, if you look at all my research, I think there's more questions at the end of the research than there were when I started. And that's sort of the tendency, isn't it? And I was thinking when Trish was talking, in the 1980s in England, the medical sociologists were pretty much as influential as the health economists, and we had a couple of shared meetings. And I think the health economists got more traction because they were trying to offer solutions. I mean, there may have been bad solutions, but at least we were trying to offer them. And, you know, the medical sociologist was just saying, well, everything's too complex, you know, you can't do anything, which is probably true. And, and so I think that was why we got some traction. But the thing that leads me to what we should do next is that, and this does relate very closely to what Trish was saying, we posed relatively simple questions that could be answered. I mean, that was the secret. So we would ask, so like pose question. So we pose questions like, is a new drug A more cost effective than an existing drug B in treatment of patient group X? And I think Trish had a statement pretty much like that. And I mean, we weren't even asking questions like, what are the economic consequences of adding drug A to the formulary alongside all the others? So we were asking a very simplified question because we could answer it. And that led me thinking about, well, what did we actually do? Well, we simplified the decision problem in three main ways. First of all, we adopted a narrow definition of the benefits of providing healthcare. Namely, it adds to length of life and quality of life. We conducted evaluations from a narrow perspective. That varies by country. In the UK, we had a very narrow perspective that we would only consider costs on the healthcare and social care budget, not costs borne by anybody else, and we wouldn't look at productivity gains and losses and all that kind of thing, which you have done in the Netherlands. And we also concentrated on relatively simple rather than complex health interventions. So a drug, although it's hard enough to do a decent cost-effectiveness study of a drug is a relatively simple technology to evaluate compared to even a medical device or, and you know, when you get into things like systems of organising healthcare, even more complex. So we were doing the simple stuff in the main. So that leads me to what next? Well, I think we should try and take a few risks and try to do a few more complicated things. So the three things here mirror the three restrictions I mentioned. broaden the definition of healthcare benefits, adopt a broader perspective, and evaluate complex interventions. So I'll say a little bit about that. So broadening the definition. Well, some people like QALYs, some people don't like QALYs, but whether you like it or not, it's a measure of health gain, not a measure of economic benefit. It's a narrow bit of the benefit that you might get from healthcare. And there's an extensive literature on other approaches to health preference measurement beyond QALYs. Some of it been done here at Erasmus. Various health value frameworks have been proposed. I think the biggest issue is, could you develop a broader measure of benefit that decision makers can and will use? I think that's the question. And I won't dwell on this because you've seen this before. This is the so-called value flower. And so basically, we're only looking at, we're only looking at this bit here and any cost offsets. But maybe in Netherlands, you'd look at productivity benefits, things that, convenience that might improve the adherence to therapy. And then there's all these other things which don't get much of a shout at the moment. There's severity of disease often comes into the discussions, like it may be better to give a QALY to some people than others, more valuable to give a QALY to some people than others. Inequity is being discussed. Scientific spillovers and the whole business of innovation, that gets a bit of discussion. But these other things like value of hope, real option value, insurance value, they're not very often discussed. And some of these may be more esoteric than others. I mean, insurance value, the interesting thing about that is that you might value something being available even though you have a very low probability of ever needing it. That's the whole. So for example, my daughter has just had a baby. There's a new drug for treating a disease in babies called SMA. It costs nearly 2 million euros, this drug, for one patient. But you think, well, it's nice to have that available if you needed it. Not many people do, but so that's the kind of insurance value. And the option value is very common for cancer patients. I have a friend who sadly died now, but he had multiple myeloma. And what he was looking for was another phase of therapy that would keep him alive long enough that he could possibly enjoy new technological advances in the future. So that's the option value of having that possibility of access to other therapies in the future. So there's maybe something in this. The issue here, the one that we as researchers have to tackle, though, is if people moan about QALYs so much, why do decision makers still use them? Well, here's my take on it. One is that maybe the gains in length and quality of life are the main thing that healthcare gives us, and all these other things may not be very great in comparison. The QALY is a metric that can be used in a standardized fashion for a sequence of decisions, because the ZIN and NICE are not just making one decision like, should we build a new airport? They're making a sequence of decisions on drugs that have to be consistent because they can be challenged otherwise. And so they need something that they can use in a fairly standardized way, whereas a lot of the other preference-based measures, they're very bespoke. So it really needs something a measure that we could use that's broader than a QALY, but we could use consistently, in my view. The other thing is we have been broadening it into equity. There's been a lot of discussion of equity. There have been some explorations of option value and the value of hope. I've got the references there. As I say, the main difficulty is finding this more generic measure that could be used in a standardised way. Broader perspective, I think this is not a new debate, but the interesting thing is it's always been put as either you have a broad societal perspective or you have a narrow perspective of the budget holder or decision maker. And I think we need to be a bit more nuanced about it, you know, that there may be some things that you don't have to have the full societal perspective. Maybe you could look at things like broadening your measure of benefit to the family rather than to the patient, for example, which I know a lot of patient representatives would support because they see families having problems, not just the patient. So we could be doing things about taking a nuanced approach to the choice of perspective. And the second Washington panel did do some of that by having an inventory of costs and benefits which you could consider relevant depending on your objectives as a decision maker. And then the complex interventions. Some drugs can be complex. A recent survey of decision makers said that they felt that things like cell and gene therapy and histology-independent cancer therapies were complex. Some analysis of screening programs has considered various complexities in their design. I think there was some work in IMTA in the early 1990s on breast cancer screening that looks not just at the question of should we have breast cancer screening, but all different modalities and mixtures of how you might deliver it. There's been a bit of progress on looking at the learning curve for medical devices, you know, the idea that the effectiveness of using the device might change as the physician learns how to use it. But there's been not so much on system level evaluations. So, for example, we're doing some work in Africa, in York, and the decision makers aren't asking us, should we have this new drug? They're asking us questions like, how do we totally reorganise our platform for providing primary care? You know, do a study of that for us. Well, that's a much more complex thing to evaluate than whether or not there's a new drug. So I think we're going to have to get used to developing measures or methods that can deal with the following. That the intervention has multiple components which actually may be modified over time. Like the intervention won't stay still, it will be continuously developing. Changes in resource use may be non-marginal, you know, there may be big shake-ups required in a healthcare system. A broad range of health and maybe some non-health effects would be relevant. And the effectiveness of the interventions may be highly dependent on stakeholder involvement, meaning that if you're evaluating, say, a new primary healthcare platform, a lot of the success of that's going to be on how the people actually buy into it. So rather than being the object of your study, these people may be people to work with to develop the intervention as you're evaluating it. And also the cost of implementation of these things may be non-trivial and could result in further modifications to the interventions. So it does get toward that more complex end of things that Trish was talking about. But as I said, I think it's a risk that we have to take. So if it's a risk, I don't care if it's a risk now because I'm nearly retired. So it doesn't matter to me if there's no funding for health economics in the future. So you're on your own. In conclusion, economic evaluation has been widely used now. I think, I'm biased, but I think it could be regarded as successful in some ways. But I think it's time to tackle some of these complexities that we've relatively ignored to date. So I'll finish there. Keep calm and carry on modelling.
Well, thank you, Mike, for this wonderful talk. Also a lot of nice quotes in it, really fun to listen to. I guess there might be some questions from the audience, so I'm looking around. Who has a question for Mike? Not all at once, not all at once.
Too close to the drinks reception, I think.
Maybe too close to the drinks? Yes, Angelique.
Well, thank you for a very nice presentation. I was wondering whether it will help us to see also to look at the real life data after implementation of a new drug, and especially on cost effectiveness, because I don't think we are doing that at this moment. And what I notice as a medical specialist and a rheumatologist, that I think that the effect and also the cost really differ from the randomized controlled trials.
Yeah, well, there's been a bit of progress on that. I mean, obviously for a long time, drug regulators have used real-life data for reporting of adverse events and that kind of thing. But the FDA in the States has recently produced a paper on how it might consider using real-life data. In England we have a process called the Cancer Drugs Fund, where if there's a promising new cancer drug that we think could be cost effective but we don't have the evidence, we put it on this kind of probationary system for a while and then revisit the decision. And I think you have something similar in the Netherlands called in the lock or in the sluice or whatever. I've heard it translated differently from the Dutch. But
the slice, I would say, probably.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot more potential. And the other thing is that for some technologies, we actually don't have the randomized controlled trials, you know, like most medical devices. And you could argue for medical devices, the evaluation should be much more skewed towards looking at it in regular use rather than in a controlled environment. Even if we had a regulation that devices had to have the RCTs, you'd still want to look at how they were being used in practice. And also that data is a good way of having a discussion with clinicians and healthcare providers about their experience as well. So it could be used you know, a lot more, and there are some initiatives in that direction.
Also in other population, I think, more multi-morbid and...
Yeah, I mean, everything can change, you know, like adherence to therapy can change. People don't necessarily use the therapies in the same way as they were in the clinical studies. The patient population changes, usually expands. And, you know, there's lots of things you could look at in real-world evidence. And of course, with the cell and gene therapy, you know, you've got a single injection that might give you 30 years benefit, but we don't know. I mean, that's a real unknown, because we don't have that experience yet. And that's why we've been looking more at the payment models to say, yes, we do need to collect the data, but is it right for the healthcare system to stump up the full €2 million when we only have 5 years worth of experience of the patients using the therapy? So I think there's going to be a lot more discussion about those things.
Yes. Any other questions? Well, maybe I have a final question then, Mike. So I saw this value flower that you proposed. And I think that's from ISPOR, lots of hidden benefits. And I always wonder, why are we always looking for hidden benefits? And why are we never looking for hidden cost? There might also be hidden cost, right? So is there also within the sort of health economics community also a sort of maybe incentive to produce also good news?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things that people talk about. One is that we should be looking a lot more at disinvestment as well. You know, like we're always looking at new things coming in. Yeah. And it may well be that if you look at things after a while, they've been nowhere near as good as you thought and a lot more expensive than you thought. And, you know, it may be time to revisit it. But I think what we found, and I think there are papers from Erasmus on this, that once something's in the healthcare system, it's damn hard to get it out of the healthcare system. So I think that's still why the effort is on trying to get the best estimate before it gets taken into the healthcare system, because it can be difficult to change things later on. Although I know the Netherlands at one point had a clinical guidelines program. I don't know whether you still do, but I was my work with NICE focused on the clinical guidelines, and that was a great opportunity to discuss disinvestment in current care as well as new care. And you'd be surprised how many things doctors will tell you don't work if you really ask them. You know, and a lot of things just get done for no reason. You know, I mean, I get my medication. I have to go and get my medication review every 6 months, and I've been on the same medication for 20 years. And you know, you think, well, what's changed in the last 6 months? But they keep doing it anyway. So I don't know. I mean, there's hidden everything, isn't it? Everything's hidden.
Well, that's right. So if there are no other questions, I know that one thing isn't hidden. It's actually just around the corner, and that's the drinks. So Mike, once again, a warm hand for this fantastic speech.
Thank you.
I think this was really a nice day. So there's been 15 minutes allocated for my closing remarks, but I'll be very brief, which I like. I think the most important thing is that I want to thank all the speakers that have contributed today. And I think Christa's making all kinds of signs that we have something for all the speakers. And I should walk towards Christa. So, sorry? You want a picture? Yeah. I think you, all the speakers, can just pick it up, right? Yeah, that's fine. Rather than hand it personally. So, all the speakers, thanks a lot. Plenary speakers, thank you even more, especially Mike and Trish. I think you had both great speeches. So this is the beginning of the year of the 40 years of existence. And Mike, we indeed were, you know, founded 40 years ago, and actually it was April the 2nd. So we didn't have to postpone it in any way due to COVID. But there will be some more events this year, and I hope they will all be just as good as this one. There's still one person I need to thank, and that's Christa, of course, because she did a lot of work and all the preparation, so please give a warm hand. I think it's time for drinks and bitterballen, hopefully. Hopefully.